So the release of Phyrexia All Will Be One is right around the corner, and I've done what I've been doing for the last few sets, make a YouTube video talking about all of the cards I think have any degree of implication in the modern format. It's important to remember that this is coming from the perspective of someone who has never cast any of these cards, and it is almost always the case that in the first couple weeks my evaluations change a little bit. But I think that these first impression videos can be really helpful for giving you ideas for the set going forward, either upgrading decks you have or like working on new brews yourself. It's always a really exciting time getting to play with the new cards. That being said, I do think there's one card that has the potential to be a very exciting modern staple, and this is really not always the case in a standard set. I think that you have some rare exceptions like Ledger Shredder and Leyline Binding and Fable of the Mirror Breaker in recent memory, but it is just not that common. You have a super exciting new staple, and I think that Capricious Hellraiser is going to be a modern staple going forward. I'm not trying to overhype it. Of course, I could always be wrong. But this is my first impression of this card. I'm very, very high on it. I'm really excited. I think this card is really, really good. Capricious Hellraiser is a 6-mana 4/4 flyer, but is going to cost 3 mana less if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. So red, red, red instead of 6 mana. And when it enters the battlefield, you're going to exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard, choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and then cast it without paying its mana cost. And so I've heard a lot of dialogue online about this card, talking about how they're evaluating it in the context of like a pure combo piece, where they think Capricious Hellraiser is supposed to enter the battlefield, cast Omniscience, win you the game, and like, oh well, you can't reliably do that because it casts cards at random. And I've heard a lot of the like evaluation of this card kind of end there, but in my mind, Capricious Hellraiser is not a combo card. It's not a put an Omniscience into play card, although it would be nice if that ever happened. This is a kind of combination Bloodbraid Elf Treasure Cruise, where it has that harsh deck building restriction, like Treasure Cruise does, where you have to have 9 or more cards in your graveyard, which is difficult to do. It's a real cost, but in a format with Dragon Rage's Channeler, and Mishra's Bauble, and Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and Shadow Prophecy, and Ledger Shredder, it's not outrageous to fill your graveyard. You have decks in Modern like Underworld Breach decks and Murktide decks that are already really focused on filling their graveyard a lot. And when you've met that deck building restriction, like with Treasure Cruise, you have what is effectively a supercharged Bloodbraid Elf. It's a 3-mana 4/4 flyer. Compare that to 4-mana 3/2 haste. That is going to cast a random spell in the same way that Bloodbraid Elf does, and it's even like less random than Bloodbraid Elves, I think, because when you're playing Capricious Hellraiser, you're going to be playing a deck with, Considers and Thought Scours and Shadow Prophecies and Fable of the Mirror Breakers, Bitter Reunions, that kind of thing. And if your deck is full of these non-creature spells, you're pretty likely to have, like, 2 choices from the ETB trigger, and so sometimes you have some selection of which of the random cards you exile to cast, which I think is really exciting. And so I think like this is going to be, again, a really good red value card, and it's also really important to note that red is currently the best color in Modern. Has lots of really good cards to fill the graveyard efficiently, like Fable and Dragon Rage's Channeler. And in addition to like it being a really good value card in the best color combination, it also doesn't have a lot of the restrictions that you usually see on cards like this. So usually cards that like cast something for free, like Cascade cards, are only like on cast triggers, or they are like bound to like the mana value of a card. Like they would, a 3-mana card that casts something for free. A good example is in the last set, Brothers War. There's Arcane Proxy. This only casts spells with 0, 1, or 2 mana value. This casts non-creature spells of any mana value. And Arcane Proxy also has the restriction that you have to have cast it for the ETB trigger to even happen. Capricious Hellraiser does not have that restriction, so that means that you can flicker it with Ephemerate and get 2 more casts. You can persist it, get a cast. You can You can bounce it with your Teferi Time Raveler, replay it. You can copy it with your Fable of the Mirror Breaker, get another trigger. You can cast Indomitable Creativity and get a bunch of triggers. And Indomitable Creativity specifically is interesting with Hellraiser since it is a red card, and creativity decks are also red, and they want to play Dwarven Mine. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on with this card, and assuming that you can get the 9 cards in the yard. That is a pretty harsh deck building restriction. This is going to be, I think, a really, really impactful piece. I do think that there is going to be an interesting conversation for a lot of decks wanting to play either Hellraiser or Undual Breach or Murktide Regent, all modern staples, or 2 of them are established current modern staples. And I have very high hopes for this card. I'm going to be playing a ton of it. You're going to be so sick of seeing this card on my channel. But that's Capricious Hellraiser. The next cards I want to talk about are Nahiri and Tyvar, 2 Planeswalkers from one that remind me a lot of old effects we've seen in the past, where in a lot of ways Tyvar is a 1,000-year elixir that has been reformed into a constructed playable Planeswalker. In a lot of ways, I think Seance, or Nahiri, is a Seance that's been kind of refined into a constructed playable Planeswalker. The comparison of 1,000-year elixir to Tyvar is a lot more clear, where they're both 3-mana permanents with the static ability. You may activate abilities of creatures as though they had haste, and then they both have this untap creature ability. Although it's really big, the Tyvar's untap ability doesn't require that 1 mana investment. But when you take a card like 1,000 Elixir and you just slap another spell on top of it, it's the same mana cost. The activated ability is now 1 less, and boom, we have an extra spell in the same 3-mana package. Mill 3 cards, return a creature with mana value 2 less from the battlefield. That's really, really exciting. Because in Magic the Gathering, when you're evaluating cards, you should get used to, what kind of return do I get for a 3-mana investment? And if you're used to spending 3 mana on a 1,000-year elixir, all of a sudden you have a new option. You just have a whole other spell. It's really, really, really exciting. It's a lot of value packed into 1 card, and it also just happens to slot really well into Elves and Devoted Druid, and potentially Reanimator variants with Priest of Felrites and Jaceren's Prodigy. But in Elves and Devoted Druid, the ability to tap your Devoted Druids and your Elves immediately, make mana immediately, is a big upgrade to all of these cards. And of course, Modern is a super removal heavy format. And one of the biggest weaknesses that decks like Devoted Druid and Elves have is that they kill your important combo pieces like Heritage Druid, Devoted Druid, Vizier of Remedies. And Tyvar's ability to not only make these pieces more powerful with the static, but return them when they die and leave you with a Planeswalker in play can be a good way for you to fight through removal and also increase the speed of your deck against more linear strategies. Will Tyvar make these style decks, Reanimator, Owls, Devoted Druid, all decks that are kind of on the fringes of Modern, will Tyvar make these decks tier 1 or super powerful? Probably not. That is a really big ask for any single card. But Tyvar is really good, and I think it is a good upgrade to these strategies, and we'll maybe give these archetypes the push they need, or maybe 1 or 2 more cards get printed. Maybe there are other packages you could play the card in. A lot of people have suggested playing Tyvar in Goblins, but I think for the most part you want to play Matron and Boggart Harbinger and Pashik Bonds. I would play 4, 4, and 1 before I played the first copy of Tyvar, and you have to splash a color. I don't think it doesn't get Aether Validate. I'm not really that into it there, but you could. But also Nahiri is also very similar to Tyvar in my mind, where it has a very similar effect to Seance. Nahiri is all about this 0 ability, where you exile a creature or equipment from your graveyard, but it's usually going to be a creature, I think, with mana value not less than or equal to, less than Nahiri's loyalty, and you create a token of it, and that token gains haste. And so, in the past, people have tried to use Seance as this kind of interesting card advantage grindy engine of Modern. I think right now, it's not something you should really consider too heavily. It's something I kind of thought about using with the Invoke Incarnations, but I think it's just ultimately too slow, since this is going to be, a 4-mana card that you have to untap with to get any value out of it. But Nahiri does everything that Seance does, and it compensates for every single one of Seance's weaknesses, with the exception of one. You're restricted to the mana value of the cards you bring back. But Nihiri brings back a creature immediately, gives the creature or equipment haste so you can attack with it. Lets you get back equipment so you have a more wide variety of card types you can recur. Its +1 allows you to put creatures in the graveyard you can recur, which is a deck building restriction for Seance. Creature cards have to go into the graveyard. And it is also like much more flexible to cast, where when you're playing Nihiri on 4 loyalty, I imagine that you'll be able to recur almost any creature you put in your deck, at least if you've built your deck correctly. Although with Fury and Solitude, you'll have to +1 before you can recur those. If you play Nihiri at 4 mana. But Nihiri being castable at 3 mana makes it like a much more reasonable modern card, since 4 mana sorcery speed effects are kind of tough. I wrote an article on Channel Fireball, but just kind of like briefly give you an idea. Creature cards, equipment cards, I think will work really well with Nihiri are Fury, Solitude, Seasoned Pyromancer, Ranger Captain of Eos, Stoneforge Mystic. Really nice to like bring back Stoneforge Mystic, grab an equipment, put the equipment into play the same turn you play it. Throwing a Ragavan at your opponents is not going to be too bad. Just to give like a few key pieces off the list. There's obviously like any creature with an ETB effect that you're recurring for value with Nihiri is going to be interesting. I think that this is going to be mostly in red-white based mid-range decks with creature with ETB effects. This is not a big range of decks in Modern. That's not there's not too many decks that meet that exact requirement, but I've played a few, like specifically the Boros Stoneblade, the Boros Moonblade deck I like to play. I think would be a really, really good fit for Nihiri. So I'm excited to cast her as soon as I can. Moving on a little bit to kind of like I don't necessarily like to say a tier below the other cards we've already talked about, but I should say that these are cards I'm less confident in. Where Nihiri, Tyvar, Capricious Hellraiser, these are cards I think will very likely find a home. Will they find home in tier 1 decks? We'll see. But I think they will find a home. And then these are all cards that I don't know will find a home, but are cards I think are interesting and we're going to try them. So I'm calling them Let's Try 'Ems. I do think that Mycon's Garden is maybe a little bit of an exception to this, but we're like Mycon's Gardens is probably going to be a really good upgrade for Amulet Titan, where the ability to copy your amulets with this card is pretty interesting and exciting. I don't know how many you'll play. The Amulet Titan experts will definitely hammer that out, but it's also like I put it in the Let's Try 'Em slide because I'm probably not going to just play stock Amulet Titan with Mycon's Gardens. Other people can do that. It'll be fine. But I think that this card has potentially other implications. Copying cards like Colossus Hammer, probably not equipment, maybe equipment. It's tough. Like that effect, copy target non-token artifact you control with mana value X, is really interesting. But I don't think it has any like really obvious homes. But it's going to be a card I have my eye on, and like I hope it really, really slots into a brew one of these days. Maybe you could play it in the Anviltron list you've been working on lately. I don't know that it's a great fit there, because like copying Semblance Anvil or copying Mystic Forge or copying Grinding Station is, you really usually need one of these things and play at any given time. But moving on a little bit, there's also a new sword, the red-green sword. I think we have all the swords but blue and black now. Maybe I'm forgetting one. But this is the red-green sword, +2/+2 protection from green. Whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn, and you can play an extra land drop. And if you exile lands with the first ability, you can play those lands with the second ability, which is kind of interesting. Like most swords in Modern, I would view this card to be pretty win-more. With the like very rare, the only spot in Modern that I really think the swords are playable is in combination with Fervent Champion. So I kind of mentioned the Boros Stoneblade deck, but I've really liked the package of 4 Fervent Champion, which is a 1-mana 1/1 first strike haste, equip cost 3 less, 4 Ranger Captain, which can find you other 1-drops, but also Fervent Champion, a bunch of swords, and then Stoneforge Mystic to find those swords. So you have like a lot of redundancy to these cards, where Fervent Champion just like magnets all the swords and play on it, hits your opponent for a lot, and puts a lot of pressure on them really, really fast, and gets kind of like gets around the kind of general clunkiness that that comes with playing these swords. Is Sword of Forge and Frontier a better value sword than Sword of Fire and Ice? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe. I want to try it. My initial inclination is that Sword of Fire Ice is likely going to be better, but I think that with that evaluation, that there may be like a really common bias that you see in Magic players, where Magic players typically think that older cards are more powerful than they are, and that newer cards are weaker than they are. And so this is what I'm going to try. I'm currently evaluating it as being worse than Sword of Fire and Ice. Maybe you play a split. We'll see. It might also just be better. So we will have to see. Next is Elish Nord, Mother of Machines. Elish Nord is a card that when it was first spoiled, I spent a whole week telling everybody on stream that this card was completely unplayable in Modern and that you shouldn't even think about it. But after hearing some pretty good arguments for the card, I have started to come around on it a little bit. Where, for the most part, 5 mana creatures in Modern that... 5 mana creature that you have to untap with, you have to have stuff with. How could you ever consider this in your Modern deck? But Elish Nord breaks a lot of those norms. no pun intended. Where usually 5 mana creatures in Modern are really resilient to remove, really vulnerable to removal. Elish Nord does not die to Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Solitude, Fury, Prismatic Ending, not Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding. Prismatic Ending, they have to do X equals 5, which a lot of Prismatic Ending decks can't even do very consistently. And the only cards that really answer this pretty effectively are like Teferi Time Raveler and Terminate. As far as like commonly played cards, that's kind of it. It is still 5 mana. But in kind of like the elemental style shell, I could actually see you like being interested in like 1 copy, maybe as an Elodomri's Call target. We'll try them. This is a let's try them. But I think that my initial evaluation of this was wrong, or at least I was a little bit harsh on it at first. Next is a card that I'm like really excited about. This one. This is Malkator, Purity Overseer. It's a 3-mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 3/3 artifact creature token. And then at the beginning of your instep, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, you make another 3/3. So if you're able to do that on turn 3, which it wouldn't be super easy to do, but it is possible if you're able to go like Artifact Land, Malkor, 0-mana artifact, or like Malkor, Artifact Land to play your Malkor, tap a Springleaf Drum, which you've already played, into like another 1-drop. This could be 3 mana, 7 power, and putting a lot of artifacts into play in your artifact-focused deck is also really interesting. Could maybe be good in like an Ephemerate style shell. Less likely, but it's also true like there are a lot of blue-white cards in Modern that have like good ETB effects and that are also like really good with artifact synergies. And so like a blue-white Ephemerate artifact deck has been my white whale for a while, where it's always felt like we're missing 1 or 2 cards, where you had Ingenious Smith, Thought Monitor, Urza, and that's kind of like it, and you kind of need like 1 more good Ephemerate target to play Ephemerate. Maybe Malkator is that. We'll see. I also want to talk about Jace the Perfected Mind. This is another 3/4 mana Phyrexian Planeswalker. Completed Planeswalker. Rest in peace, Jace. Enters with 5 loyalty if you spend 4 mana, 3 loyalty if you spend 3. And is a really interesting card where I think the first place you look at it is going to be for mill. And it might be a good card for mill, where it has a -X ability. Target player mills 3 times X cards. So 9 cards on 3 mana immediately, or 15 cards on 4 mana. And I think that mostly, like, if you're playing this in a mill deck, this is like good when you're top decking. Like, oh, I just need to draw 1 big mill spell to win the game. And so you can top deck Jace, 4 mana, and you mill 15 in the game. But I think for the most part, you're going to be wanting to use this -2 ability really well. Target player mills 3 cards, and if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3. So this ability will not be online on turn 3 very often outside of a mill deck. But when it is online, it is very, very strong, especially because like can play it on 3 mana, draw 3 cards, and then you still have a Planeswalker in play that your opponent has to deal with. The +1 ability to shrink a creature -3/-0 is actually really relevant against Dragon Regis Channeler and Ragavan decks. Enters Dauthi Voidwalker pretty reasonably well too. Can buy you a lot of time, and so I think that you might see this in Mill. You might see this in a like Dimir Into the Story, Drown in the Loch style control deck as well. I think it's less likely it ends up making the spot there, but you could see kind of like a more hybrid control-y version of Mill. We've kind of seen versions like that in the past. The next card on the list is Phyrexian Vindicator, one of the most exciting cards from the new set. A card that like if you imagine this being printed like 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, it would have been what's the word I'm looking for? It would have been like just a crazy exciting card to be printed. Now I feel like, at least in the context of Modern, you're like, well, huh. How about that? Phyrexian Vindicator is a 4 mana, all white mana, 5/5 flyer, and if it would be dealt damage, you prevent all of the damage, and when you prevent the damage, you get to redirect it to any target, including opponents. So, 2 things about this card. It is a 4 mana creature, but it's a 4 mana creature that's at least immune to Unholy Heat, and other red removal spells, of course, that aren't Terminate. And it is a card that has a really harsh deck building restriction, all white mana. The only deck I've played in Modern that can even think about this are like the mono white Heliod decks that I've been working on lately. I think that those decks are pretty good, and I think that Phyrexian Vindicator is like really good against specifically Murktide and Hammer. I don't think it'll be amazing against like really any other strategy, but like against Murktide and Hammer, this is a card that will be very hard for either of those strategies to beat. Is it main deckable? Is it just side deckable? Is it just like never playable at all? I'm not sure. But it's a let's try him. I think it's a let's try him. It may be like the least promising let's try him though. Next, we have 3 cards I'm putting in the category of fun but fragile build-arounds. These cards are cards that I don't expect to have any serious constructed implication. I could be wrong about Venerated Rotpriest specifically. Let's talk about that one first. This is a card that has a lot of hype around it. It's a 1 mana 1/2 toxic 1. Whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. I've seen a lot of players want to put this just in like stock infect. In my opinion, don't do that. I think any number of Venerated Rotpriest are going to be worse than any number of other infect creatures you can play. Because since like, you know, you don't get any extra damage when you cast a pump spell on this. You get one infect damage. You get 1 extra infect damage instead of like the +5 you would get from I can't remember the name of the card. The make a creature 6/4/6/4 or become immense. In any of the pump spells, it's like a significant reduction on the pump. And I've had some people present the argument, oh, if you have your infect creature in play, then Rotpriest is going to like add an extra poison counter for each pump spell. But this is like much less important than having a protection spell for your creature, having an extra backup creature if your creature gets removed. Especially because like, you know, Inkbuff Nexus plus plus like 2 pump spells is very often enough to kill. Sometimes 3, but like that 1 extra infect is just not that relevant in general. I do think that Venerated Rotpriest has interesting implications, specifically with the card Ground Rift. Ground Rift is a 1 mana red spell that has Storm. Target creature without flying can't be blocked this turn. So if you are able to storm off and cast Ground Rift for 10, you're able to poison your opponent for 10. And that might sound like a lot, and it is. And the problem is that that even if you're able to like storm for 10, your opponent can kill your Rotpriest in response to the targets being the storm trigger to even stop you from going off, which is why it's fun and fragile, but interesting. And Storm 10 is actually, I think, going to be a bit easier to assemble than you might think, where if you have Spellskite in play, you can storm off for just 5, target your Rotpriest, then move all the copies over to Spellskite, and then win the game on the spot. And then Summoner's Pact gives you an extra storm count and also like finds you your Rotpriest really quickly. You have to win the turn you play it, but in theory that should be the idea, right? You can play Manamorphose, and then you could also play Lava Dart potentially, where if you have Lava Dart, you can go like play flashback Lava Dart. You can only Lava Dart your Rotpriest 1 time because it has 2 toughness, but you could go like 3 mana, Rot Priest, Mutagenic Growth through Rot Priest, play Flashback Dart. That's 3 extra counters right there. And then your storm count for your Ground Rift is 5 because you have the Rot Priest, the Mutagenic Growth, the Dart, Flashback Dart, and I guess you need like one more in that spot. But Dart, Dart is like 1 mana, 2 extra storm counts, but also 2 poison counters, so you have to like storm off for less anyways. Is the main point I'm trying to make there. There's also a card Gather Courage, which is pretty exciting. It's 1 green Convoke, so you can play Rot Priest, Convoke it for 0 to add to the storm. Again, fun, fragile. Maybe will be better than I expect. I'm definitely going to try it, but not a card that I expect to have like big modern implications, to be honest. The next card is a card that like would have really big. I don't know if that exactly fits in this category, but Karu Monix the Rat King. This is a card that would have like really, really big modern implications. This would be a very, very strong card if it was a merfolk, an elf, a goblin, a human. If instead of being a 3 mana 3/3, into the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal any number of rat cards among them, and put them into your hand, the rest on the bottom, giving everything else toxic 1. If this was like a tribal card for merfolk or elves or goblins, this would be like the most exciting card in the set, probably. It's not. It's for rats. As far as I know, there are not like really any modern playable rats. That being said, there is a land, Swarmyard, that regenerates a rat or like a bug or something, I think. Like, it's a couple other, but rat, I think it's rat, squirrel, insect. So now all of a sudden you have 2 really powerful tribal payoffs for rats. And there is also like a really kind of fringe changeling deck that uses like Magda and Grist sometime. But if you could just reveal changelings to this potentially and use it as like a pretty interesting card advantage engine, maybe to Pyre of Heroes into. But also like even if like you can't get the job done now, if there's like just like 2 or 3 constructed playable rats printed in modern over the next 3 years, there's a deck. We're far away from that deck now. I haven't really looked super hard at rats. I will do more looking at rats just to see if I'm wrong, but this effect is really strong. And now there are 2 really good payoffs for being rats in modern, so just something to keep your eye on at the very least. There's also Uncuttus. Well, I don't know. This feels like the kind of name of a Magic card that was never said out loud. Unctus. I don't know. Maybe I'm just dumb, but I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that. Grand Metatect. But beyond the name being confusing, it's a 3 mana 2/4. Other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. Other artifact creatures get +1/+0, and you have a Phyrexian blue to make a creature control a blue artifact in addition to other types. And for all the youngins out there used to be a pretty fringe playable modern deck called Blue Steel. They used Grand Architect and Chief Engineer to like power out big artifacts. And this card plays really, really interestingly in that package. It's kind of like the potential 9th through 12th of that effect, and it's like a pretty big, powerful upgrade. And I'm gonna try to build it. I don't have high hopes for it. But I just can't help but try. And so keep an eye out for this one. It's a pretty powerful card. I think that it's unlikely to make a big splash, but it's a card that I at least like a lot. Moving on, it's always important to talk about sideboard cards from the new set. Not super exciting to do, but very important to do. When you're building your sideboard, you have to have all of these cards on your radar. You have to understand what it is you're targeting, what it is your deck has, like what deck building restrictions you have that you'll want to play. One of these 3. And so Cantanker Bloom is very similar to the Duskwatch Werewolf that is also a 2 mana creature that you can spend 1 mana to destroy an artifact or enchantment, but instead of flipping into a werewolf, this is a 3/2, and this can proliferate instead. So the only deck I think that would really be interested in this is like Hardened Scales, where you can bring this in against Stony Silence and Leyline Binding and Rest in Peace. But if they don't draw those cards, you can sack it and proliferate and deal a lot of damage potentially. And in kind of a similar way, Soulless Jailer is a disruptive hate bear that does something very similar to Drannith Magistrate. This card mostly just like stops Reanimator and Cascade. This is like, it does both of those things. Usually Drannith Magistrate only stops Cascade, and you have other cards to stop Reanimator. This one does do both and has 4 toughness, which is nice, but the big difference is honestly that this is a colorless card, and most of these other options are white, and so now every deck has access to this kind of effect, which is interesting and something to keep on your radar, and it's just kind of a boring sideboard card, but one you need to be aware of. Minor Misstep, I also think, is going to be relegated to the sideboard. A lot of people are really hyped about this one. A lot of people think that this is going to be, a main deck counterspell in Murktide and like most modern decks, and people are going crazy for it. Not everybody, but some people. I'm not nearly as high on this card. I think it's not a card I'd almost ever be interested in main decking. I think it's a card that competes a lot with, Spell Pierce and Flusterstorm and Invasive Surgery as like your anti-Cascade sideboard card. I think that for the most part you want to select Minor Misstep if you want an anti-Cascade card and you also want extra equity against Hammer Time. You want extra equity against Burn. That's about it. For me, it's not super exciting. I don't like that this card is horrible on the draw, especially when you compare it to Spell Snare, card that's great on the draw, where you play your land, they play the 2-drop, you counterspell this. So if you're on the draw with Minor Misstep, your opponent plays the Ragavan, this was your answer to Ragavan, you're kind of screwed sometimes. That being said, I could be wrong, but that's my current evaluation on Minor Misstep. I wanted to highlight this one a little bit more because I know it's had a lot of buzz about it so far. I also kind of want to briefly talk about these 3 cards I'm putting as low impact main deck cards. Ossification and Shieldred's Edict are 2 removal spell options. I think that they're both main deckable. I think they also compete with the plethora of other good white and black removal spells that exist in Modern. For the most part, Ossification, it's a 2-mana sorcery speed, exile a creature or Planeswalker until it leaves the field, and you enchant it on a land so it can be vulnerable to cards like Besage and Cleansing Wildfire, those kind of effects. This is a card that Enchantress might want to play. Enchantress can struggle with Planeswalkers, so this is like an okay option, and then Shieldred's Edict is also an okay black removal spell that will be fun. Could be better than I think. Maybe it's like particularly good with Snapcaster Mage is something I've been thinking, which is kind of exciting. But removal spells are not cards you can build around. They're really not cards to get too crazy about, unless they're like as crazy as Leyline Binding. They are playable, fringe playable, low impact main deck cards. Also Mirex, this is a card that I think is good. Obviously, like if it's main deckable in sub decks in Modern, it has the potential to be good. I could see this in an affinity style shell where affinity decks like will want like maybe one source of colored mana from their land one time to cast like a Thought Cast or Thought Monitor or equip a Cranial Plating, and then they could just have for colorless the rest of the game. And then when you can do that on a land like this that can make artifact creatures, that's kind of interesting. I don't know that Affinity would want to play the Mirex, or how many copies you'd want to play, and like how many colored sources you count it as. But it's a low impact main deck card. It's one you should consider when deck building. Okay, so next up, I want to talk about some Fringe archetype upgrades. These are cards that will be kind of low impact upgrades to existing decks in the format, but are pretty good to go over. I think maybe the most impactful will be Kimba the Enduring. I think that Hammer Time will probably be interested in playing 1 or 2, but probably 1 copy of this card in the main deck. Kimba is a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever it or another cat enters, and this is probably going to be your only cat, you can attach up to 1 other target equipment you control to the creature. And it gives equipped creatures +1/+1. So beyond just being like a core outfitter, it's like an upgraded core outfitter because everything +1/+1 or everything equipped +1/+1. And in the very late game, it also has the 5-mana ability to make a 2/2 cat creature token. So if in the late game you have 7 mana against Scam or like blue-white control, and you have a hammer in play, you can go Kimba. Kill your Kimba in response, and then you can make a cat and then attach the hammer to that cat instead of the Kimba. So you just get like a little bit of extra equity there. I think, again, you want probably just 1 copy, but I think the first copy will be pretty good. A card that I think is less good is a card that it has maybe a lot of implications in Pioneer more so than Modern, is a Squirrel Deflector Might. It's a 1-mana 1/1 toxic 1, can't block. For a Phyrexian white, you can choose a color. Another target creature you control gets Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until end of turn. I would basically never play this before the 4th copy of Giver of Runes, but if you ever feel like you want 5 Giver of Runes, you can play 1 copy of this card. And it is kind of nice that it's an artifact creature, so it helps with Metalcraft for Pure Steel Paladin, and it helps with like construct size, but for the most part, it's not a card that I think you'll see more than 1 copy ever in Hammer Time, especially because it's legendary too, like Kimba. Moving on, there's a big upgraded Kadoltha Rebirth, Gleeful Demolition. You can destroy an artifact for 1 mana on either side, and if that was your artifacts, you can make 3 1/1 Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. So there's a very similar card, Kadoltha Rebirth. It's a 1 red mana, sacrifice an artifact to make 3 goblins. This is like just almost strictly better version, especially because you can target your own indestructible lands and not blow anything up and get 3 goblins, and obviously destroying your opponent's cards. But what's most interesting is like in the decks that are built around Kadoltha Rebirth, you can now play 8 of this effect, which is really nice, and you can go like Rebirth, Demolition, Bushwhacker, attack for a lot. Unlikely to be super impactful, but I'm likely to try it. It could be better than you think. You might also play this card, Exuberant Fuseling, in that deck, maybe as a budget option. But Exuberant Fuseling reminds me a lot of Ravenous Squirrel, which is a 1 mana 1/1 when you sacrifice a permanent, I think, or maybe just artifact or creature. I think it's just artifact or creature. It doesn't trigger off fetch lands. It gets a +1/+1 counter. And this is also when an artifact or creature is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, it gets an oil counter, and it gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it. So not buffing its toughness, but it does have trample, so it can maybe like one-shot some opponents through blockers. Ravenous Squirrel is a card that I actually think is really powerful. It's really nice, specifically in combination with like Witch's Oven Cauldron Familiar, where you're able to like just trigger the card twice a turn every single turn, and being able to play like 8 Ravenous Squirrels now is actually kind of interesting, and you can see it in like the Gleeful Demolition deck too, but again, unlikely to make a big splash. Conduit World, it's not too crazy. I think this is a card you could play in mono green Tron as a tutor target. I like that you can replay your Tron lands if your opponent's been Besiegeing you, and if your opponent's been Besiegeing you, you'll have 2 forests a lot of the time to cast your Conduit of the Worlds. I think it's also going to be like a nice card advantage engine, and I think like a pure card advantage card is something that I've kind of wanted in my Tron wish boards in mono green Tron at Modern. Not a big impact, but something I do think will probably be like good enough to play. And then lastly on this slide, we have 1 Urza Saga target option. This is Dross Spellbomb. Like the other Spellbombs, you can just spend 1 mana to sack it, draw a card. But you can also spend 3 black mana, draw a card, and return a creature from your graveyard to hand. So if you're playing like Jund Saga, maybe a little bit of a bigger version with like Seasoned Pyromancer, Bloodbraid Elf, maybe the Capricious Hellraiser. I could see being interested in this as like your grindy Urza Saga target. Maybe like you don't end up playing this over other options very often, but it is an option, and it's like kind of good to have on your radar. And then other cards to keep on your radar are cards that I lovingly refer to as radar cards. I've been doing these in every video, or every set release video, but these are cards I don't think fit anywhere and are probably a little underpowered, but these are all cards that like one day could be like the critical missing piece to a brew. So I like to kind of put them in my own mental database, and I like to put them in your mental database too, if you're ever trying to do some brewing in Modern. So the first one is Malera the Living Cure. This is a 2 mana 3/3 exile Malera the Living Cure. Choose another target creature artifact. When that card is put into the graveyard this turn, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It also is an anti-infect card, which is relevant if it's relevant. It's a little bit of extra flavor text, but for the most part, that's not why you'd be main decking this card in Modern. So when you compare this to the other older version of Malera, Malera was a 2 mana 2/2 that was, you sacrifice it instead of exiling it, but it returned only creatures. But so that card has some combo potential. It goes infinite with Renegade Rallier and like Altar of Dementia. But this card would be more of a value card. And what's kind of cool about that is you can return artifacts, which is not that relevant, but is extra text that the other version doesn't have. And it's also a 3/3. And so like it has better stats on its own. It's a more reasonable threat. It blocks Ragavan instead of trading for it. It does return Fury and Solitude. I don't think that this is likely a card that you'll again want to be playing, but you could even just play it as like 2 mana 3/3 and then protect like your other like creatures and like your Death and Taxes deck or something. Again, not a big card, but card to go over. And then you have 3 instants or sorceries that like do a thing and then proliferate. Thirsting Roots, search your library for a basic land, put your hand, or proliferate. And then Restoration returns a permanent card from your graveyard to hand, proliferate. Augury is anticipate, proliferate. Look at top 3, 1 in hand, then proliferate. Again, these are all don't seem to fit in any existing strategy super well. Maybe one of these would fit into Hardened Scales, but I kind of doubt it. But I could see one day, maybe with future support too, like just needing a missing piece, a key enabler. And these are kind of interesting enablers for decks that are either looking for card selection, plus like powering up their counter cards, recurring their counter cards, maybe wanting to cheat on land drops if you're playing Thirsting Roots. But again, just on your radar, don't need to think too much about them. There's also Mirren's Safe House. Is a 3-mana artifact. If it's on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of land cards in graveyard. I think right now, the most interesting thing to do with this would like maybe to be pair it with Cabal Coffers. I think that every single time a land with an activated ability gets printed, this card does get stronger. I'm likely going to go like deep in the sauce and try to see if there is any combos with this card, if there any like brew potential with it, but right now it's just kind of in my database and is not like a big priority. Going to be something I kind of like get to later, if that makes sense. So again, don't dwell too much on this. Just store these kind of cards for later is kind of how I like to think about them. But that is the video. Thank you for watching. I like to do these videos. If you have any feedback on this style, this format, I'd really appreciate it. I think they're really good to go over. They're good to go back and watch, and I hope that they've been somewhat helpful in your thinking about one going forward. That's it. Goodbye. I've been Aspiring Spike. See you next time.